Welcome back, everybody. So to close out the day, we're going to have two concept presentations. These are one new and one renewal of an existing program, things that we're looking forward to doing in the division over the next year or so. So the first presentation is going to be by Chris Duncan in the Genes, Environment, and Health branch, presenting a concept on data and metadata standards and efforts to promote the development and adoption of a harmonized environmental health language. Chris?
Thank you, David. As David mentioned, I'm Chris Duncan. I'm a program officer in the Genes, Environment, and Health branch, and I coordinate data science programs in the Division of Extramural Research and Training. Today, we are seeking council approval and feedback on a new concept on data and metadata standards efforts to promote development and adoption of a harmonized environmental health language. Our program team includes Michelle Heacock, Bonnie Jobert, Cindy Lawler, and Carol Schruffler, with input from many other DIRT staff. This concept builds on several previous NIH and NAEHS workshops and other efforts held over the past decade to mobilize the environmental health and biomedical communities around language and data standards development. This concept seeks to provide catalytic support for a diverse array of environmental health-focused standards resource development activities. So in this presentation, I'll cover three main topic areas. The first is the importance of open data standards. The second, I'll discuss harmonized language as a persistent challenge for the environmental health sciences. And then finally, I'll provide details on the new concept being proposed. Let's start with the importance of open standards for data and metadata. So to get us thinking about this topic, I'd like to start off with a question. How can we benefit from the volume and diversity of data and knowledge that are produced in environmental health sciences? The field of EHS encompasses a diverse array of data types, including chemical, environmental, geospatial data, genomic, metabolomic, imaging, and mechanistic data, as well as social, demographic, health, and phenotypic data. Also, there are many diverse perspectives involved in the generation, interpretation, and use of these data, including experts across many different scientific domains, health professionals, data scientists and curators, regulators and policymakers, as well as the broader public and the communities impacted by environmental exposures. However, collectively, it's hard to reap the benefits from these data and these perspectives. Often, data are not collected in the same way, and key details of how data were generated are unclear or often missing. And variables and features have different names, units, and formats, and these ambiguous or missing details are frequently a barrier to interpreting, combining, or reusing data. To add, the practice of documenting exposures is incredibly complex. Exposures can originate from many different sources and can be documented at many different levels, ranging from exposures in the ambient environment to exposures at a personal level to precise dosing at a high resolution. Also, exposures can be documented across a wide range of biological receptors, ranging from the molecular level to cells, to tissues, individuals, all the way to the population level. Further, exposures can be associated with a wide range of outcomes across multiple scales, ranging from dynamic changes to molecules and cells to disease states for an individual or across a population. So building on these complexities, and as Rick mentioned earlier today in his talk, the global environmental health sciences field is coming together around a conceptual framework of the exposome, which comprises all of the exposures to which an individual is subjected to over a lifetime. This includes the many physical and chemical exposures that a person experiences, where the person lives and works, what they eat, what they do, person's social experiences, as well as their corresponding biological responses. So many complexities here. So what are open standards for data and metadata, and why should we use them to help address these challenges? The universe of data and metadata standards is quite large and varied, with no single simple definition. For the purposes of this concept, we're using the definition used by the US EPA, and also that's used in the NIH Strategic Plan for Data Science. That is, data and metadata standards are documented agreements on the representation, format, definition, structuring, tagging, transmission, manipulation, use, and management of data. Open standards for data consist of many different types of agreements on things like words, identifiers, taxonomies, file formats, units, data types, models and schemas, and codes of practice for how we collect, annotate, and transfer data. Open standards are useful for many things, including facilitating use, access, and sharing, improving comparability, enabling aggregation and linkability, and enhancing data quality. Open standards can help us fill critical gaps in our data infrastructure, support policy and regulation, and ultimately promote common understanding. So in thinking about the development of data and metadata standards, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. It's critical to leverage and build on existing standards and other resources, as well as the lessons learned from those resources. There are many existing standard vocabularies and ontologies. For example, the Kebi Dictionary and Ontology for small chemical compounds, the gene ontology, which represents knowledge about the functions of genes from many different organisms, SNOMED CT, which is a standardized vocabulary of clinical terminology used by healthcare providers to exchange health information, and the HERE ontology from the NAEHS supported Human Health Exposure Analysis Resource Program. Also, there are several existing minimal information standards. This includes Miami. You may have heard of Miami. It's the minimum information about a microarray experiment, which is used to specify the information needed to interpret and reproduce a microarray experiment. And MIADI, or the minimal information about animal toxicology experiments, which was recently developed through support from the Superfund Research Program. It's important to leverage and build on existing schemas and templates, such as the OECD Harmonized templates for reporting chemical test summaries, and the CEDAR template tools to create structured metadata templates. It's important to leverage common data elements, and these have been developed through initiatives such as RADXUP and frequently available through the NIH CDE repository. Further, it's important to engage the efforts of existing knowledge bases and other data resources that are curating the knowledge that are relevant to our field. And these include the Comparative Toxicogenomics Database, the AOP Knowledge Base, and the Monarch Initiative, and many more. Also, as we think about the development and use of data and metadata standards, it's important to take an approach that accounts for the data standards lifecycle, where each of these stages is considered carefully. These stages are development, including the initiation, establishing key collaborators, contributors, and user communities, establishing requirements and use cases, design, testing, and approval. The open dissemination and distribution of the standard, supporting community adoption and use of the standard, evaluation, including establishing formal metrics and evaluation methods, and maintenance, including review, revision, and retirement of terms and annotations. So at NIEHS, we're striving to foster a fair data ecosystem for environmental health sciences. That is, an ecosystem where the data we support are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. When we dig into each of these, it's clear that data and metadata standards are essential to fair data. For instance, to be findable, it's important that data sets are described with rich metadata and that they're provided in a way that can be indexed in a searchable data repository. For data to be interoperable, it's critical that data and metadata use a formal, accessible, and shared language for knowledge representation. and that the vocabularies that are used are documented in a way that follows the FAIR principles. Additionally, to achieve interoperability, metadata should be linked and cross-referenced. And finally, for data to be reusable, it's critical that metadata have multiple attributes that richly describe the context under which the data were generated, and that those metadata are associated with detailed provenance. Ultimately, it's just easier to reuse data that are organized in a standardized way according to the relevant community standards. As a part of the NIH efforts to develop policies that support a fair data ecosystem, the NIH has recently released the NIH Policy for Data Management Sharing. This new policy will require investigators to submit a data management and sharing plan with applications beginning in January of 2023. Under this policy, plans should address the 6 elements that are listed here on the slide, and standards is indeed one of these 6 elements. Here, investigators should indicate which standards will be applied to the scientific data and metadata associated with the proposal. In preparation for this policy, NIEHS has been requesting data management sharing plans for several of our RFAs. For many of the plans we've received to date, when we look at the standards element, we often observed a response like you see on the screen here. Specific consensus data standards are not widely available for the data types to be generated in these studies. Something we need to address. So with this in mind, I'd like to transition to discussing harmonized language as a persistent challenge for environmental health sciences. Looking over the past 10 years, a common theme has emerged across efforts to advance data sharing, data integration, and artificial intelligence for exposure science, environmental health, precision environmental health in the exposome. That is, there's a collective recognition that the lack of harmonized data approaches, harmonized language approaches for describing environmental health data, findings, and knowledge has been a barrier for research and policy decisions. Over the past decade, NIEHS has engaged the environmental health and larger biomedical data science communities around harmonized language. This includes a joint workshop with EPA in 2013 around advancing environmental health data and analysis through finding a common language. A 2014 workshop on the development of a framework for an EHS language. A 2015 workshop as part of the NIH BD2K program on community-based data and metadata standards, as well as a BD2K RFA utilizing the R24 mechanism. Further, NIEHS has incorporated language standards as a key aspect of the Cheer and Hear program, as well as the Superfund Research Program Data Sharing, Integration, and Reuse initiative. Also, data standards were a key aspect of the NIEHS Informatics and Information Technology Strategic Roadmap. Most recently, a cross-divisional group led by the NIEHS Office of Data Science launched the Environmental Health Language Collaborative, and we hosted a workshop on catalyzing knowledge-driven discovery through harmonized language. I'll provide a few additional details on that effort. The Environmental Health Language Collaborative, or ELK as we call it, was launched in 2021 to coordinate an ongoing community discussion around advancing integrative environmental health research by promoting access, use, and harmonization of data through interoperable terminologies and best practices. ELK sponsors several ongoing community forums, including a public webinar series, use case-based working groups, and an annual workshop series. Through these efforts, ELK aims to provide a forum to coordinate harmonization activities, a community of practice to exchange information, ideas, and expertise, and a platform for collaboration in the development and application of harmonized language solutions. Also, through these efforts, we've had an opportunity to connect and learn from other agencies such as EPA and CDC, as well as other groups such as the Research Data Alliance, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, the Gene Ontology Consortium, the Monarch Initiative, and many others. However, it's important to note that participation in ELK is volunteer-based, and the collaborative does not provide funding support for the participation, technical development, or implementation of these recommendations in the domain communities. Collectively, these efforts point to several ongoing challenges. First, there are gaps in standard terminologies, vocabularies, ontologies, and related schemas. For many of our EHS domain areas, consensus language and data standards are lacking. Second, data curation and harmonization efforts are challenging and time-consuming. Currently, there's a lack of templates, tools, software, workflows to implement standards and to make curation easier. Next, standards development work is often done by volunteer effort, and the development frequently occurs in the context of a focused research project. And this has resulted in many efforts being siloed or project focused. And finally, standards gaps lead to challenges from the scientific perspective for researchers and practitioners in describing and comparing findings, organizing and representing data, finding and integrating data for analysis, linking data and knowledge graphs, and ultimately addressing large-scale, complex EHS research questions. With these ongoing challenges in mind, I'll now transition to discussing the proposed concept for today. So today we're proposing a broad concept to provide catalytic support through research resources for a diverse array of environmental health-focused standards development activities. For this effort, we propose to utilize the toolbox of NIH mechanisms for research resources. For these mechanisms, the focus is on resources to serve a broad community, rather than to focus on specific research projects. Available mechanisms include the R24, U24 mechanisms, which we're currently utilizing for various data resources. The purpose of this concept is to support resource-focused projects to enable the environmental health domain and subdomain communities to openly develop, extend, adapt, or refine data and metadata standards, as well as the associated tools to implement those standards. Through this program, we aim to address key gaps in the environmental health language, support activities at multiple points across the data standards lifecycle, and foster open sharing of products, outcomes, tools, and softwares, as well as best practices. For this concept, there are three main areas of anticipated activities and outcomes, which are open standards for data and metadata, tools for standards implementation, and collaborator, contributor, and user community engagement. Importantly, it is critical that these three areas be synchronized rather than sequential to support timely adoption in our scientific communities. I'll go through a few details of each of these three areas next. So first, open standards for data and metadata. This involves developing, extending, adapting, or refining data and metadata standards in key gap areas of the environmental health language. The intended scope and key ideas here include supporting curation and harmonization for a diverse array of science areas relevant to the NAEHS mission, promoting consistent information sharing, interoperability, and common understanding, and leveraging and building on existing standards and resources. Examples of some anticipated activities and outcomes here include clear, unambiguous terminologies, controlled vocabularies and ontologies, common formats, structures, and rules for data exchange, minimal information standards, modular metadata reporting templates, schemas that link together semantic meaning and data, and guidance and codes of practice for measuring, capturing, or sharing data. The next area of anticipated activities and outcomes is tools for standards implementation. This involves developing, extending, adapting, and refining software tools to implement data and metadata standards in the EHS community. The intended scope here is making it easier for people to curate data and share high-quality data, and facilitating the adoption of consensus standards. Key ideas include following best practices for open development and sharing of research software, supporting the FAIR framework, and leveraging and building on existing tools and resources. A few examples of anticipated activities and outcomes include web templates and software for automation of metadata capture, software tools for terminology mapping or harmonization, tools for data transformation into common formats, data submission and curation workflows, as well as related APIs to support standards implementation. The third area of anticipated activities and outcomes is collaborator, contributor, and user community engagement. This involves engaging the relevant persons, groups, and organizations throughout the data standards lifecycle. So I've used the term community several times, so I just wanted to define that term. For the purposes of this concept, community encompasses a broad and diverse range of individuals or groups involved at various points throughout the standards lifecycle. So this includes science domain experts, researchers, ontologists, librarians, data scientists, data stewards, data engineers, software developers, vendors, repositories, societies, publishers, advocacy groups, and other end users. Importantly, this also includes consideration of domains outside of environmental health. The intended scope here is addressing the social aspects of standards development and promoting engagement across disciplines. In many cases, the social issues around standards development is often more difficult than addressing the technical issues. And another important point that we expect in that line is that we expect a significant component of NAEHS coordination to be involved in this program. Examples of anticipated activities and outcomes here are convening expert panels and working groups for standards development, building social networks and consensus across domains or organizations, facilitating use and adoption of standards through workshops, trainings, or other research mechanisms, understanding how and why people are using standards, and then importantly, incorporating user feedback in the evaluation and maintenance of the resource. So what does success look like for this proposed program? We expect that the metrics of success will extend across all stages of the standards lifecycle. This includes the development of open standards and supporting tools, including new or extended ontologies, vocabularies, schemas, and data models, as well as these new or extended templates, workflows, and tools. Importantly, each product should be accompanied with robust documentation and user guides. We expect open dissemination and distribution of standards and tools, and these products should be indexed in public registries such as Fair Sharing. Community adoption is critical for success, including the endorsement and use by relevant groups and data resources. Also, we hope to see these standards being incorporated into data management and sharing plans submitted to NAEHS. And ultimately, we want to see data sets disseminated in data repositories that are utilizing these standards. We anticipate formal metrics and evaluation methods that are used to measure usage and usability. And finally, we anticipate that the standard development process, it's a dynamic and living resource. So we expect to see ongoing updates, revisions, and extensions over time. In summary, we're seeking council approval to initiate a program to provide catalytic support for a diverse array of EHS-focused standards resource development activities. However, this is a complex and challenging topic, and we're requesting council input for several areas. These include, what are your suggestions on how we can best structure this program? How do we best set the focus for individual resource projects? How to maximize adoption and use in our communities, and how to optimize coordination with other domains and agencies. We would really appreciate your feedback on these and other areas. So at this time, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your feedback. And I will now turn the virtual podium over to our lead council discussants, Dr. Phil Bourne and Dr. Lynn Goldman.
And Phil, I was thinking you'd probably lead off, but.
Okay, I'm happy to do so. Saying I thought this was not a good concept would be like saying I don't love my children. I mean, this is, to me, an absolutely essential part of what it is you propose to do in the future as an institute, and how important it is. So I commend you, Chris, and the team for putting together what I think is something that's really compelling. And you've addressed a lot of the issues that I was certainly thinking about, having been involved in doing these things for many years. I know we've also had an exchange back and forward, and Lynn as well, so I'll let her weigh in a minute. But just to make a couple of points, I think in many ways you've made a number of them, but I think it really helps to emphasize. And clearly the amount of effort that's required to make this successful is huge. And I think everybody underestimates how long these things take. So I think there needs to be patience, tolerance, and a funding stream that's going to persist really as long as data persists to make this work effectively. But the payoffs, clearly, I think we've seen it in other fields, can be really huge. So it's just essential as we have more and more digital data. So just a couple of comments. You actually mentioned the three elements working together, but just to emphasize, I think that when it's really the domain experts who really have to engage in this to define the elements of the standards. And but they are generally not the people that actually produce the software that supports the standards. And you talked about synchronization. I just emphasized that it's really critical that that happens. Otherwise, the adoption is going to be very slow. And so I think how you think about synchronizing through the funding calls you make, the software development with the standard development itself is really critical. I think the emphasis on the role of resource leads as major participants, they understand the data better than anyone, and they really need to be the active participants in this. Obviously, they're also the people in their respective resources that also have software capabilities typically. So I think that, again, that support's going together. The statement you made would likely include an aspect of NAEHS coordination. I can't overemphasize how important that is. There's an old axiom that perhaps everybody's heard, but I'll say it again, that standards are like toothbrushes. Everybody has one, but they don't want to use anyone else's. And I think you've got to be in the business of really, as an agency, really using the power of the dollar to really facilitate how these come together. And it's almost, I think, to some degree in my mind, looking back on all of this over many years, I think being more dictatorial about what standards are going to be used and adopted in funding calls, I think can go a long way to accelerating the process, both of getting the standards in place and getting them adopted. And then I would say, that I think you mentioned a number of these other efforts, and in our exchange, I now understand that you've had some workshops already where you've brought in various people from, I think there's a long history of things that have worked and not worked here over the years. And the community engagement is clearly the most critical one at various levels. And you're obviously already well on that pathway. But I certainly encourage you to continue to bring the right people to bear on this whole situation. So a lot more can be said. I'd love to be engaged with you in any way as you develop this out further, because I think the 4 points you had right at the end, you just can't cover them in a session like this. But I think we would certainly we're more than willing to help you undertake this incredibly complex. I mean, this is so much more complex than anything we've done that I've actually been involved with personally, that relates to things like structure or genomic data. I mean, this is the complexity of this data and the scope is huge, but the payoff could be huge as well. So good luck. Godspeed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bourne. And I did indeed include your feedback into the presentation, and we'll include those points as we develop the program. And I'm sure we'll take you up on the help as we think about this in the future. So thank you again.
So I could add a little bit. I think I agree that this is extremely important, and also that it's very difficult. And when I was looking at your timeline again, Chris, I was reminded of how much time has already been invested in trying to build toward this point. And yet I feel that there is urgency around getting this done, and especially with the new requirements on investigators. The more of those data that are provided publicly without standards, the less useful that's going to be. And over time, that's going to become more and more problematic. And I've had many problems in my life that were caused by people not understanding data, people who know how to acquire the data and analyze it because they are, quote, data scientists or whatever, but they don't know the difference between, for example, a bone cancer, primary bone, versus a cancer metastatic to bone. Those are two different things. And that's a case that I dealt with at one point. And that can create a public alarm and a lot of issues that are very very difficult. I think that our community has been slow to harmonize, and I do agree with Phil that there must be incentives given. I was engaged myself years ago when the OECD set out to harmonize standards around testing and assessing toxicological hazard evaluations to chemicals. And I was quite successful, actually. But what I observed is that the people who were staffing that were not from any of the individual countries. They certainly were from a country, but they weren't representing a country. They were representing the process, and were able to be honest brokers, and were really skilled at kind of steadily keeping the processes moving forward. And at times where we had vastly different concepts, even around things that seem basic, like what's a carcinogen. And that was simpler than what you're trying to do, a lot simpler, because you're trying to go well beyond toxicology into all the fields in environmental health. And so it's actually quite difficult. So it needs to be inclusive, but I think that it needs to be brokered in a way that everybody feels that it's fair, that there's a fair table that they're sitting around. I think also, and we've had a little bit of a conversation about that, but not to forget about the libraries, the National Library of Medicine for one. That definition you gave for metadata, I think it actually comes from them. Everybody else, uses it, but maybe not. Maybe someone else came up with it. But I do know that in my university, as we are getting ready to deal with the new DMS plans, that one of the resources that's reaching out to investigators is our library. They feel they can be helpful with that, and I do think that is probably going to be one of the touch points, I think, as Phil mentioned, where you'll have the ability to motivate people if they are required to use these harmonized standards, in those data plans. Other than that, I mean, it's hard for me to see exactly. Well, I think also, journal editors, that has been effective in other fields as well. That that if journal editors are educated about standards and demands that the standards are followed, that also is certainly a motivator. See, OECD, it was like, you want to have things in the market. And, we had pressure from our industries around coming up with these standards because these things have been, kind of unnecessary barriers. And I'm not sure that you really have that. The last point I wanted to make, though, is does this need to be considered as an international issue or just a national issue? So I do think that, for example, the classification of diseases is an international classification of diseases. We don't classify diseases differently than how they do it in the UK or Germany or Japan or Korea or China. And that is tremendously advantageous in terms of the scientific literature around diseases, that if you have an ICD code, it is used the same way by everybody in the world. And I do think that that's something that is worth considering, that, to do the work that needs to be done here, with the NAEHS, but to then figure out whether it's the OECD or UNEP or UNEP, I don't know. We could talk about that at some other time, but that there does need to be, I think, a common language that we all speak globally. And I don't know, you didn't mention, but has the European Union already been trying to do the same thing amongst their countries? It would not be good if we're heading down divergent paths with developing standard language. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldman. You raised a lot of great points, and I'll touch on a few of them. I agree that this has been a long time coming, but I feel right now, like you mentioned, with the data management sharing policy, the emergence of AI, machine learning in our field, we're hearing about data standards and the needs for those at many of our grantee meetings. So paired with the work of the Environmental Health Language Collaborative, I feel like we've got a lot of momentum now, and we want to sustain that. I think a second point is the collaboration with the National Library of Medicine. I think that's a great suggestion. And we are certainly encouraging applicants to partner with their librarians at their local institution in developing data management sharing plans. So that was certainly an excellent point. And the question about, is this an international issue? I would say the answer is yes, certainly yes. We have been interfacing with the European Human Exposome Network through ELK, the Research Data Alliance. These are different ways, at least through the Environmental Health Language Collaborative, we're trying to reach across the ocean and make these connections. But certainly the answer to that question is yes. I think go ahead, Dr. Goldman.
I just wanted to say thank you for responding to my questions. And hands have been going up since you first since you put your first slide up. So I think maybe it's time for Phil and I to cede the rest of the time to our colleagues here. But anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. Dr. Vasquez, I think you are up next.
Yeah, Chris, thank you for that. And also for Phil and Lynn's comments and insight. It is a huge issue, one that should be addressed, but I think I have a few questions. So I guess my first question is, how would these standards relate to those that are required by other entities? For example, as editor-in-chief of 2 journals, actually, and editor on many, we sometimes, as the editor-in-chief, and of course, the management higher up in the journals, they require certain things for certain types of data, and it has to be presented in a certain way. It has to be given and provided in a certain way. So and not every journal is the same. So that becomes a complication, I think, because if we want a standard, or you're setting a standard, which would be great if NAEHS could do that, but then it has to sort of correlate at least, or associate with the journal policies, or we can't publish. The other is institutions. So every university or institution, they have certain policies about certain things, even simple things like MTAs for sharing data and that kind of thing. And that's different, at least at the places I've been, it may be different. So I think it's just something to look into when thinking of a big global plan, is looking at other entities and what they require to simplify everything, or it just won't happen, right? It just won't happen. My other question is maybe more of a concern, particularly with metadata and that kind of thing. So as a perfect example, the Human Genome Project, sequencing the human genome, fantastic, monumental work. But there were so many errors in the original sequencing data. And then how you would call mutations it differs by each. I mean, I was on a student's committee that's her entire project was just identifying different techniques to call mutations. And then everything you see is different, right? Even from the same data set. So I think we only get out as good as we put in. So who's setting standards, particularly with AI and everything else coming on board? Who sets the standards for what is accurate? We don't all want to be sharing data from a same set that's not correct. And is that something that you're thinking about? I mean, I don't know how you would do those checks and balances, but it's certainly something to think about. Because even if we all use the same language and we all comply in the same way, if we start with something that's not right, we're just going to continue to generate things that are not accurate. So those are just, but wonderful job on this. I'm so glad that you're taking the lead on it, because it's a big problem to tackle, but it's something that's clearly needed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vasquez. Two very good questions, and very, very difficult as well. So in the relation to other entities, I think always when it comes to standards, it's reuse, adapt or extend something that's already existing. That's the first option. We don't want to be proliferating a bunch of new standards, exactly what you're saying. So for example, the HERE ontology is utilizing a bunch of different existing ontologies, and it's pulling those together to formulate the appropriate ontology for that program. So again, I think it's adapting, extending existing standards as the first choice. And then, with the journals and institutions, it's getting the right people, very inclusivity is the absolute preference here, right? You want to include all of these different communities, organizations in the discussion, and provide a mechanism to provide that type of feedback. So it's tough, though. You're exactly right.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you for your efforts. And Bill and Lynn, thank you for your comments.
And then the quality standards, I think that comes down to the individual subdomains and fields. We employ these through many of our consortia at NAEHS, the Target program, HERE program. So I could definitely see that as part, but it kind of depends on where the domain sits.
Right. So you're thinking more just like our standard peer review.
Well, it's something that can be built into the pipelines and workflows for data submission, quality, automated quality control checks. It would be excellent to add those into the pipelines. But again, it's field to field, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Dr. Miller.
Yeah, so I was at that 2013 meeting that was on the graph in these discussions early on, and it's at times frustrating that it's taken so long to get where we are. One of I'll be a bit provocative here, is, as Karen pointed out, from a journal perspective, journals have quite a bit of control, but they're also in a very competitive landscape. NAEHS runs a journal that is very popular, that gets a lot of submissions, and they have full autonomy. Like, I think NAEHS should set the standard, and it's really about just pick an ontology. It doesn't have to please everybody. You just pick one and say, this is what we're going to require for the journal at this institute, and set that standard. And then whether or not you start putting it into grant sort of requirements or something are different. But like a good example, we were talking about this connection with all of us and including environmental data. You know, if we don't go into that sort of study with a solid ontology for environmental health, it'll be a disaster. And so I think it's one of these things we have to move it ahead quickly. And I think NIHS is in the right place to lead it.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Appreciate your support, and I agree with what you're saying here. And I think we can discuss with our colleagues at EHP and see what we can do on that front as far as the journal. So thank you. Dr. Hertz-Prochodo, I think you're up next.
Thank you. I applaud this effort enormously, and the discussion with Phil and Lynn really highlights and kind of brings up for me, you know, yeah, sort of, yes, I've been there too, kind of thing. And the one thing I wanted to say is, it seems like this is, you know, you're doing this project, but it's not going to end. There's never going to be an end to this. That this is a process, because new methodologies and new terms come out, and then you know, how do you harmonize when, you know, the group in Harvard is doing this and the group at USC is doing that, and the group, you know, in terms of language and terminology that they'll introduce when new technologies come on board and such. So yeah, so I just a little footnote that, you know, be sure to be thinking about the maintenance and the continued ongoing process that will need to follow what you see as the end points, which of course, you know, there will be a point where you say, okay, we're rolling it out, you know, and maybe it'll be in sequence parts of it, but you know, it's just like you remodel your home, and within 1 month you start seeing all the things that aren't quite working right, falling apart already, and I don't know. So
yeah, thank you so much.
And congratulations on getting where you are so far.
And
Thank you. Yeah, standards indeed are a living resource.
Sorry, Chris. I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to let that be the last comment. Since this is a concept, we do require a vote from council. So if I may have a motion to approve. Phil, and a second. Gary, and if council members would please vote in the electronic council book.
There's quorum.
Okay, thank you, Liz. And thank you, everybody. Chris, great job on your presentation. And John, if we can get Michelle's slides up.
Actually, David, before we move on,
Right. You wanted to make a comment about it.
I just want to make one comment. I just want to remind everyone that EHP is, you know, NIEHS's journal, but the agreement is that the editor-in-chief and the editorial staff do have editorial independence. So it would not be up to Rick, Trevor, and others to dictate to EHP what they will do or what they won't do. But certainly, this reports into the deputy director. Our Dr. Archer will bring this up with the editor-in-chief. I think it's actually a very interesting point. So I don't know, Trevor, do you want to add anything?
Rick, just I would say that yes, I think it is a really interesting idea and proposal, and I think we should definitely bring it up with Joel and the editorial staff.
Great. Thank you, Trevor and Rick, for getting that on the record. Okay, we have reached the final presentation for the day. I hope everybody has saved some energy. This is going to be every bit as interesting and broad as the last presentation, I'm sure. So this is a presentation by Michelle Heacock on behalf of the Superfund team on the renewal of the Superfund research program.
Thanks. Just a quick check that you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And thank you very much, Doctors Duncan and Belsha for all the pressure to keep everybody stimulated. Kudos on a good presentation, Chris. So my name is Michelle Heacock, as Dr. Belsha just said, and I get the pleasure and honor to represent the SRP staff, Sarah Moglegby, Daniel Carlin, Heather Henry, Brittany Trache, and Bill Thook, who has been the director for the Superfund Research Program since it started in 1986, but he can't be with us today for a very good reason. His son is getting married. And I am here today, as Dr. Belsha mentioned, to propose a continuation of the Superfund Hazardous Substances and Basic Research and Training Program, Multi-Project Center Grants, or the P42 program. So this is the SRP team. I just went through the names and I just wanted to put some faces to the names and also use this slide as a way to give a special acknowledgement. Oftentimes we see program staff up right and center, but what we don't often see is grants management and grants review. And this is just to acknowledge that it is a really robust collaboration between all three of these divisions, our branches within our division. So this is grants management, a special acknowledgement to Jenny Greer, Lisa Archer-Edwards, and Michelle Victorino. And grants review, special acknowledgement to Alfonso Latoni, Laura Thomas, and Charmise Outen. So all of these people have been heavily involved in the last iteration of the last P42 RFA. The Superfund, we are mandated under legislation that was put forward by Congress, called the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, or SARA. And this may be a reminder to mute yourself. So this was enacted in 1986, and this is what mandates Superfund. And what we're showing here in these rectangles, these 4 green rectangles, are our mandates. So that's supporting research to advance techniques to be able to detect, assess, and evaluate human health effects in response to being exposed to hazardous substances. Ways to understand how to assess the risk to human health presented by hazardous substances, ways to be able to detect hazardous substances in the environment, and finally, this last mandate, which is structured around remediation, is really the thing that distinguishes us from most of the other NIH biomedical research programs. And this is the mandate that is directed for us to support research for basic biological, chemical, and physical methods to reduce the amount and toxicity of hazardous substances. So we have, as you can see through the 4 mandates, we have both biomedical research and environmental science and engineering, or non-biomedical research, that we support. And we do this, our program consists of integrating these kinds of sciences with an emphasis in research translation, which is different. It's not bringing it to the clinic. It's a little different for Superfund, and I'll tell you what that is in subsequent slides. Community engagement, data science, and training. And just to also quickly point out that it's not hazardous waste, it's hazardous substances. And the last thing to say, it's not a site-specific program, so we don't require our grantees to work at a Superfund site. So we're also, in addition to our mandates, of course, we are guided by our strategic plan. Our last strategic plan is, the most recent one is 2020 to 2025. What we want you to see here is that it is providing direction to both SRP grantees and program staff. This is a bi-directional effort here. And here what we're looking at is as a program to work together to address high issues of high relevance, to maximize the impact of program investments, to foster innovation. The strategic plan also is emphasizing the importance of broadening potential partners or end users. You're seeing that below in this teal rectangle, SRP stakeholders. So in addition to our Superfund agency, federal agency partners, the US EPA and the ATSDR, it's other federal agencies that are affected by hazardous substances such as NOAA, USGS, DOD, and DOE, and of course other stakeholders that you'll be not surprised to hear, like state and local agencies, as well as tribal entities who are responsible for the sites, as well as of course is the individuals and communities that are living near hazardous waste sites. The final thing that we'd like to point out with our last strategic plan is the strategic plan called for our researchers to really think about using a systems approach to really understand how all the pieces are fitting together. And this is really almost the same as what we think of when we think of systems biology, but it's bigger because we're looking at how people are exposed and how we can make the maximum impact. And I'll go into that in a subsequent slide. If you're interested in learning more about our strategic plan, you'll see a link here at the bottom. In terms of evolution, we're just highlighting a few things. And I should say, boy, did we have trouble on what we were going to highlight for you today. There's a lot that we can choose from, so just know that it was difficult. In terms of evolution, what we wanted to share with you today is just some of the cores that we formalized the requirement for. So always putting an importance on research translation and community engagement and training, of course, but here is where we actually formalize the cores. The most recent core that we formalized or that we required is a data management and analysis core, and this was in 2019. And I'll go into a little bit more about what that core does in subsequent slides. And I just told you about in 2020 is when we released a new strategic plan. Another thing that we wanted to share with you is just what does our history look across the program? And there's nothing like seeing how the funding evolved. And what you're seeing here, I told you that we were 1986 when SARA, the Superfund Amendments Reauthorization Act, established the Superfund Research Program. 1987 is when we made our first awards, and they don't obviously look the same as what a center looks today, but we did fund a couple of awards. And as we move through the years, you can see this purple line is steadily increasing until you reach about 2004, which is where you start to see this plateau. And we share this with you just to make you aware that we are, as per our strategic plan, working to maximize the impact of the research dollars we receive and in turn award them through grants to our researchers. One thing we have tried to do to maximize that impact and maximize the funds we receive is to move from an annual review cycle that we started in 2004 and move it to a review cycle into every 2.5 years. And this was, again, just something that we were working on to try to maximize the budget that we were given. This slide is showing you so you saw the budget. This is how we spend our money. You can see several mechanisms that are on this slide, and I won't go through all of them just for time, but if you're interested, I'm certainly happy to go into more detail. What we're going to focus on today is the multi-project center grants, or the P42s, but just to show you that we do fund other awards such as the R25s, R21s, R01s, which are more geared towards that non-biomedical piece or environmental science, as well as supplements. So looking back, just to give you what are some fun facts about Superfund? Perhaps the most, I think everyone from the staff will agree, we're most proud that
Am I the only one that lost Michelle's audio?
Yeah, I did too.
I did.
Uh-oh.
I can't hear her either.
Michelle.
I think you're fine. Go ahead and speak.
I think she's coming back online. Stand by. I think she's switching headsets and needs to unmute.
Hey, let's see. Does
Okay,
that
yeah,
work?
we got you. We got you.
Okay.
And you had just gone out like 30 seconds before I came back in, so we didn't miss much.
Did you hear about the trainees?
I don't think we heard about
No, we didn't hear about the trainings.
No,
Michelle.
we did not.
Okay.
Trainees.
Okay. Well, we wanted to make sure that we supported this. This is one of the things that our program staff, I'm sure, are all going to agree, and Heather interjected, so she's right on board, is we supported more than 2,500 trainees. And this is something that we're very proud of. And in fact, the program analysis branch conducted an analysis to look at the impact of where were environmental health sciences trainees, what was the breeding ground, and really the Superfund Research Program was something that was a groundbreaking place for them to get most of their training. And I'll go through why we think that might be in subsequent slides. We also awarded grants to more than 1,300 researchers at more than 120 institutions and small businesses. And over 11,000 peer-reviewed publications have been published by our awardees and over 200 patent inventions. And in terms of the return on investments, like what kind of impact are we having financially from the research that we're supporting? We did in 2018, we conducted a study or an analysis to look at what kinds of impacts, financial impacts is our program making, and looking just across 5 tools that were meant to remediate or to site monitor Superfund sites, we found that just those 5 tools saved over $100 million compared to just using traditional approaches. If you're interested in learning more, that's a hyperlink, and I believe the slides will be provided. So where are our centers located? So the P42 centers, the multi-project centers across the country. What you're seeing is the current P42 centers, and each one is denoted by a blue dot. Looking in addition to that blue dot, a lot of our multi-project centers are collaborating. We see that as a key piece in our program. So for instance, the Northeastern Center, while it's based in Northeastern University, it actually has collaborating institutions. So the University of Puerto Rico is where the PROTECT study is being undertaken, but there's also collaborations in the University of Georgia and Michigan. The green X's are the grantee field sites. So these are the places across the country. Each of our multi-project research centers are either conducting community engagement activities or testing technologies to see whether or not they work in the real world and a real world scenario. This is another slide to kind of give you this 30,000 foot view. What do our grantees study? And this is closely aligned if you're looking at some of the terms here with the 4 mandates that Congress has guides us for what we fund with our the funding we receive. So that it's no surprise that it's our grantees are studying first, how people are exposed in the first place, what they're exposed to, considering other factors that might be contributing to the health effects. So things like, does an exposure combined with microbiome or stress contribute to an even greater health effect? And then, as I mentioned earlier, that 4th mandate, reducing exposures, is something that distinguishes us from the other NIH basic biomedical research supported grants. And that's how can we reduce exposure so people aren't exposed in the first place? And in the cases that they are exposed, how can we now work to mitigate or minimize the impact of that exposure through things like interventions and nutritions and therapies? So looking across, what kind of exposures do we have in our current portfolio? So these exposures range from metals, so things like arsen, chromium, and lead and uranium, to things like emerging contaminants or maybe contaminants of emerging concern. We touched a little bit, and we're going to talk more about PFAS. So we do have PFAS, as Dr. Balshaw mentioned in his presentation, as well as emerging contaminants of concern, 1,4-dioxane, and in addition, complex mixtures. And then looking across, what kinds of research are we supporting for the biomedical research-based projects? It ranges right from the basic biomedical fundamental research, so things like understanding how inflammation that results from a hazardous, how is a hazardous substance eliciting inflammation, to health outcomes. So understanding how a hazardous substance might be contributing to metabolic outcomes such as obesity, or how obesity on top of a hazardous substance might make a health outcome worse. All the way from metabolic outcomes, looking at organ dysfunction, to cancer outcomes. In terms of our environmental science and engineering projects, so this is kind of that non-biomedical arm of the P42 centers we support. I've already touched on things like remediation approaches. So using things like microbes, plants, chemicals such as persulfate, or physical means such maybe even the sun, to try to degrade or minimize exposures from happening in the first place, as well as understanding how are exposure or hazardous substances moving through the environment to become bioavailable in the first place. So public health impacts. I told you before we had a devil of a time trying to find the things that we wanted to highlight because we had a lot we wanted to share with you. And so this is just a few things we wanted to share in these next couple of slides. This is an example of the public health impacts, really representing an arc of research. So across several years, how has moving from fundamental research moved to an impact? And if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to refer to that link in the bottom left of the slide. But what I will call your attention to is a couple of such impacts. And so the top one is just an understanding of how a hazardous substance led to an inflammatory response. And it was this fundamental understanding of the mechanism that was involved that led to the design of therapies. And what was wonderful about this is that this therapy is actually being applied to a wide range of diseases. And then another kind of impact that we'd like to point out is one that is taking arsenic research that has been discovered across several P42 centers, mostly from our Dartmouth P42 center, and working to share that information, so translate the research to stakeholders who need to know it. And so this particular health impact is one that helped lower the arsenic limit for drinking water in New Hampshire. A couple of other impacts of ways that we communicate impacts. I told you that one of the key things in our strategic plan was it's the grantees working together with SRP staff, program staff, and this is grantees sharing the good things that they're doing with us, and we're in turn doing what we can to make sure that that research gets communicated. Another way we do this is research briefs. These are done on a monthly basis. This can either be delivered to your inbox, or you can find it on our website, or if you prefer, it's available in podcast form. And so this is just an example of a couple of research briefs that were featured just a couple of years ago. The next impact that I want to share with you is just something that is another way that we help distill and bring the research from our centers to as many people as we possibly can. And this is through risky learning, which is something that we work together with EPA, our EPA partners. And this does get a very large audience. And this is where we share key thematic areas a couple of times a year. And here you're seeing, if you look to the middle of where this gray rectangle is, you can see that a couple of them is risk communication strategies to reduce exposures and improve health. This leveraged off a very successful workshop that again that included a collaboration between SRP staff, largely led by Sarah Mogley, and Sarah, I do that with your name all the time, I'm sorry. And ATSDR as well as EPA. And what you're seeing here on the left is just an example of such a tool. So this tool was developed to help communities when they are experiencing flood situations. How can they understand whether or not contaminants, they have an increased risk of being exposed to a contaminant? And just a little plug, we have one coming up soon on climate change and health. So we urge you to stay tuned, and we're happy to put that information right in your inbox. And I'll show you how to do that at the end. Finally, we also do a Science Digest, which is quarterly summary of findings. And this is another way that we try to communicate what our researchers are doing to a larger audience. And so here you're seeing just a couple of bullets of some things that we have done, and are some things that we have featured. And Chris Duncan just touched briefly on data integration initiative that we had. And this last bullet is such an example of that. And so this particular use case was trying to see the bigger picture in order to improve remediation. So can we start to look at how things like the microbial composition, the fungal composition, and the pH of the soil are coming together to affect remediation? So now I just want to spend a couple of slides going into what those P42 centers look like. Before I do that, this is just an overall view of what the P42 centers look like. So this is a overview of a center. So here what we're trying to convey to you is a center consists of course of the research projects. This is the basis, this is the foundation of a center. And it's coming together with several cores. And these several cores are meant to work together to try to maximize the impact of the research so that it gets translated, it includes community input and SRP stakeholders involved. Because as you see, we're working towards trying to develop solutions to pretty complex problems that aren't unique to Superfund, of course. It's just nobody's exposed to just one hazardous substance at one kind of exposure. On the right, this is how we're now trying to depict this, what you see on the left, where I said that we are asking our researchers to consider using a systems approach in our last strategic plan. And what the rationale for this is to try to understand how things are working together. What are the dependencies? So bringing together information to understand what are the best places or leverage points that can be used to apply those disruptors to help prevent exposures and mitigate health effects. So and done in a way that is timely and feasible, reasonable and feasible within the constraints of time of a community. So that's what we mean by a systems approach. So understanding what those dependencies are so that we can understand where the spots are that we can make the most impact with a strategy to reduce exposures or mitigate exposures. This is a pie graph of what the centers look like. This is just another way to show what you just saw on both those diagrams in the previous slide. And this is just to show you, again, the biomedical and the environmental science and engineering projects are the foundation of a center. And each center has to have at least 2 of these. Required also is a administrative core, a data management and analysis core, community engagement core, a research experience training and coordination core, with the option to include a research support core, giving where there's a maximum of 11 components when we consider all of these pieces of the pie. The total budget that could be requested currently with the last RFA was up to 1.75 million per year direct costs for 5 years. The other thing we wanted to share with you on this slide is just to indicate where we've made some tweaks and changes. And this is, again, trying to make the biggest impact we can with the program with the funds that we have. So first, turning to the research projects, I told you that it's a minimum of 2 of each of these kinds of projects. Biomedical are in line with the mandates, and it's just what you think, just understanding. And yes, epidemiology is certainly considered a biomedical research program within Superfund. And it's a way to use all of these kinds of disciplines as it relates to what the center is trying to accomplish, to understand how people are exposed and why they're and what is eliciting these health effects. And then in green is that environmental science and engineering piece. And this is where you're seeing an asterisk. And this is just to say, this is where we made a tweak. So these environmental science and engineering projects, again, are meant to try to understand how we can detect hazardous substances in the environment, understand how they're moving through the environment to to bioaccumulate, to become bioavailable. But then also where this asterisk comes into play, how we can understand and develop ways to reduce exposures in the first place so people aren't exposed at all. And so this is a tweak that we made with our recent RFAs. The administrative core and research translation, this is another required core. And as you can imagine, with any administrative core in any center program, this is a key central piece that functions our planning and coordination, promoting this cross-disciplinary interaction among the projects and core, overseeing fiscal and quality management. And this is another tweak. Because of this central piece, this is where we incorporated the research translation component and how we're defining research translation. So not necessarily communicate or not translating basic science findings into something that can be applied to clinical practice. This is trying to ensure that the research is getting past things like Web of Science or PubMed into the hands of the folks that need this information. And this is done by communication within SRP, to SRP staff, across to other end users, with partnering with government agencies, and technology transfer. Next is the Community Engagement Core, and as I know all of you appreciate that community engagement is a key piece to environmental health sciences, and Superfund feels no differently about that. This is this bi-directional communication that involves the community in the center's research. And again, you're seeing an asterisk here, and this is meant to say this is where we made a tweak to the Community Engagement Core, where researchers proposing a center were needing to address prevention and intervention that would help reduce exposure. So addressing that mandate number 4 again, and this is just to within the theme of the center. And I should back up. What I realize I haven't told you is a center, we have all those components. We have two different kinds of very different kinds of science, biomedical and environmental science and engineering coming together. And it's often done for a common theme. So that theme can be based on a contaminant, or that theme can be based on a health outcome, or a combination of both of those things. And of course, our targeted target communities are communities that you all are not going to be surprised at. It's tribal groups, it's environmental justice communities, including under-resourced communities and groups that have been economically and socially marginalized. So next is the Research Experience and Training Coordination Core. This is also a required component. And this is where we were just touting how proud we are of being able to support over 2,500 trainees. And the functions of the core is meant to really promote interactions between biomedical and environmental science and engineering trainees. So this is a key thing that Superfund can offer. If there's a biomedical trainee assigned to a biomedical research project, this core is going to help facilitate the cross-pollination with environmental science and engineering, giving them exposure to many different kinds of disciplines and perspectives, as well as this core promotes the involvement of trainees in community engagement, research translation, as well as with the data management and analysis core. And I think we heard a little bit about the importance of training and data management and analysis. And of course, the importance of making sure that we're including trainees from diverse backgrounds. Data management and analysis core was something that's new that was required in 2019. And the job of this core is meant to support the management and integration of data assets, regardless if they're small or big, across the center. So the idea is the data management and analysis core is working to poise the center to be able to integrate data across the center. I told you earlier, centers are coordinated across a theme, a research theme, and the data management and analysis core is meant to do that at an even deeper level, at the level of data. So the data management and analysis cores have data scientists on board who are working with project and core leaders to help them with that, and of course help them with data management and analysis plan. As we all know, this is a requirement. A data management and sharing is required coming just this January. So with that, we are proposing to continue the current program structure and function of the P42s. And here's why we want to do that. We hope that we have shared with you that we want to continue to advance collaborations. These collaborations were done through things like the data science supplements. These collaborations are done through things like Casey Donnelly externships, where we provide funding for trainees to be able to train in a different P42 center to sharpen their skills or to learn a new skill within the program at another center or even at another federal agency. We want to continue to value the community and the research enterprise. As we've heard before, you can't have environmental health research without involving the community. To promote cross-disciplinary training, we see our program and as it's structured as a unique opportunity to do just that. Encourage diversity. There is nothing like getting those diverse perspectives to see a different way to solve problems and even understand maybe problems that we didn't even know existed. I just told you a little bit about the data management and analysis core, and this is one thing we want to continue is to enhance data management and sharing. So we want to continue to support center integration and of course, adhering to the NIH data management and sharing policy. And of course, to embrace a systems approach. We told you earlier why we were interested in being able to use the systems approach as a way to think about understanding how all those pieces are fitting together so you get a more comprehensive understanding. And if you could start to leverage the data as well, this might help you see things, connections that maybe you hadn't been able to see before. This list that you're seeing here is a list that was developed in concert with our EPA and ATSDR colleagues. And this is something that is seen in the suggested research and activities. This is communicated through our RFA. It's on our website. And this is just something that helps our researchers understand some of those vexing issues that are of interest across Superfund research program as well as EPA and ATSDR. And so this is going to come to no surprise to you that these are vexing issues. And after hearing some of the discussion today, of course, it's emerging contaminants and contaminants of emerging concern. Susceptible populations and predisposition, of course, understanding combined exposures. We all know we're not exposed to just one thing. And we also know that your social economic status can dictate how you might respond and what your health outcome might look like. Of course, emerging exposure pathways. So this is things like thinking about climate change and how that might increase or even decrease the exposures, and things like the microbiome. How is this interplaying with exposures for the good or for the bad? And of course, the exposome, which really is everything that you see in all of these bullets. So finally, I told you a lot about the communicating of how we communicated impacts. We could not do this without the active communication we receive from the researchers that we support. And these are just some links that we please encourage you to visit if you want to learn more about our program. And if anything, an easy way to, let me go back. To get on any of these listservs, so you can have things like the research brief delivered right to your inbox, is to just go to srpinfo@niehs.nih.gov. And finally, we're celebrating 35 years of Superfund, and our annual meeting is being held December 14th through 16th. It's being held in Raleigh, North Carolina, and this is through a collaborative effort between our UNC and NC State P42 centers who are taking the lead on planning this. So you are all invited. Here's the link if you would like to register, and let us know if you want to learn more. And I will thank you for your time and turn this over to the council discussions, Dr. Kavanaugh and Dr. Penning. And I think Dr. Penning, you might be leading the way for this.
Yes, that's correct. So Michelle, thank you so much for your presentation. A very impressive program you have here. I've been a fan of this program since I first heard about it many years ago. And I think I attended one of the annual meetings in Raleigh, and I remember Gwen Coleman saying it was a jewel in the crown for NAEHS, and I think she's absolutely right. What makes your program really unique and outstanding is the marriage of environmental science with environmental health science. The engineering component and the remediation component that you have makes this program stand out and actually impacts the research translation component of what you're trying to do. And it's very important that your research translation is a little bit different from just thinking about health translation to improve patient care. So that is, a real unique aspect of your program. the concept of having two non-biomedical and two biomedical projects that are linked together by a theme is very persuasive and compelling. The issue of being able to do environmental engineering, to do exposure reduction, remediation and mitigation are all very unique to the program. And I also think that your biomedical components dealing from mechanism all the way to health effects actually provides a way to actually start thinking about how we can mitigate those health effects at the individual level as a person that's been exposed. I also like the idea that this is not a Superfund site specific emphasis, and that it's actually can be very different from that. That gives you the opportunity to look at an exposure that might affect many Superfund sites across the country, as opposed to just working on one Superfund site. So I think that's a real strength of the program. One of the things I think you do have to pay attention to is that you don't become unbalanced in your portfolio. You have a large number of contaminants that you're interested in, and it's very easy to actually adopt the contaminant of the moment and not actually have a balanced portfolio. And I know you've been thinking about that, but I remember many years ago, there was a lot of emphasis on heavy metals. And I think you decided to start moving away from that, and advisedly so. And now PFAS is the new contaminant on the block, but you don't want it to be a PFAS program, nor that's your intent anyway. So I have kudos for the program. One of the things I also like is the systems approach, whereby you're bringing into these different components, not just the biomedical and non-biomedical, but also the issue of actually having these different cores and how they start integrating into the central theme. So I like the idea of this being a overall system that you're trying to put together for these complex centers. And I think it does actually provide the glue to bring all these different components together. So I think that's a strong component. One thing I did notice, and this is not really of your making, it's really dictated to the Superfund program as a whole, is that just as your level of funding was leveling off for this program, that also most coincided with the addition of some of these additional cores, which means that as a result of trying to create this systems approach, you actually can get less done for the amount of money that you have for the program. Not that those cores are unimportant, but it does create a push-pull on the situation. You want to do great science, and you also want to have this systems approach with these cores, but your funding is staying flat. And so that's a problem that I know that Rick is very interested in, trying to work with the Superfund research program in trying to improve the funding level for this very important program. And as we heard from Rick earlier today, the funding for this has been increased, but really it's a drop in the bucket in terms of what it really needs to move forward with these various entities. And when you look at it, you have 4 cores and at least 4 projects making 8 things, and a direct cost of 1.75 million. That's not a lot of money for 8 different components when you start dividing it up. And I know that one of your issues to deal with this was to put the research translation core into the admin core. But I also think your research translation core is one of your very important outcome metrics. What makes your program different is the research translation core, and how actually it doesn't just affect human health per se, but you're dealing with the mitigation and remediation of hazardous substances that are very important for the environment. And so I like the slide that you had where you said that saved $100 million, but I think it's that kind of emphasis we need to not lose by putting the research translation core into the admin core. So I would recommend that when you write the RFA for the new Superfund research programs, that you make it as part of the review criteria, a robust research translation course. It doesn't get diluted out by the admin core where you now have it placed. I also recognize that your funding stream for this program is not from HHS, but from the Department of the Interior. And therefore that requires a different way to present the program to your funding source to persuade them that this program needs more money. And you know, with it being flat and you take into account inflation, you've actually taken a reduction in what you can actually achieve in a significant way. A few other things I'd like to comment on, which I think are worthy of thought, and that is for your community engagement program, you clearly have it as bi-directional, and it'd be nice to think about different aspects of community engaged research that the centers might do, all the way to community-based participatory research, and you probably do have examples of that. But I'm also thinking that one of the things that I have seen is that the research translation to the communities goes beyond the remediation phase of Superfund sites. Sometimes after remediation has occurred, there are additional problems that the community can still be faced with in terms of who takes ownership of the site after remediation, who is going to monitor continued health effects, and so on. So I think a post-remediation phase should be a component of the community engaged component of this. Also, for the research experience and training coordination core, it'd be nice to actually have some robust training in entrepreneurship training, so that the trainees are actually really starting to think about how what they're discovering in the field or at the bench can actually be translated in the way that the Superfund program wants it. And last but not least, I would say that the data management core is absolutely essential. And we've heard a lot today about the FAIR principles that this core needs to be embracing, as I'm sure that is the intent as well. So overall, this is a fantastic program, and its biggest weakness, I think, is its underfunding, and its strength is its outcome metrics, which are just very, very impressive. So I think I'll stop there and give other people the opportunity to comment.
Just before you get started, Dr. Kavanaugh, just a nod of thank you for your insightful comments, Dr. Penning.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for a wonderful presentation and overview of the program, which I also am very impressed with and think it's just a wonderful program at NAEHS. And I echo all of Trevor's comments regarding the structures of the program and how you've put emphasis on the various cores. I think I agree that this has a unique position or place at the Institute, in that it's one of the few places where you can get funding to do ecosystems research and restoration, ecology, and associated remediation types of technologies, and get them applied in a translational way. I think this is a really important aspect of the program. It's also important, as Trevor said, for the training of cross-training of students, postdocs, and other researchers in the program to have that exposure, especially if they're interested in carrying on with multidisciplinary research in their careers. I think one of the other things that's really important about this program, besides the training, is its emphasis on risk and risk science. And there's a lot of that going on in the program. And I think that that's particularly important when we think about not just human health risk assessment, but ecological risk assessment. And especially since the natural environment can both be a target and a vector for contaminants that get into human bodies. And so I think that's a really important aspect of the program. I also commend the group on the really excellent communication tools you have. I personally love the Risky Learning webinars. I learn a lot from those, and I know that the rest of the EHS community does. But all of the programs, the research briefs, the science digest, all of them are really great. And I really like how there's lots of participation from the grantees in those, and also the annual meeting is a fabulous meeting and a really opportunity for trainees to present their work, especially and junior investigators to learn more about other research that's going on across the program. Regarding the flat funding, and I know this is a difficult situation, and I'm wondering if maybe we can have some discussion about some mechanisms to address that would potentially involve some of the other core centers like the P30 centers and others as a way to support infrastructure. You have that one little block there that has to do with the research support cores. I'm presuming that those institutions that are fortunate enough to have a P30 center can supplant the need for that in a lot of cases because it provides the infrastructure, or perhaps they have, institutional support that can do that. But would it be possible, and I don't know if this is possible because of potential commingling of funding sources, whether or not the P30s could be have a competitive supplements program to help support some of that work. And I see, David, you're nodding your head that it might be a problem in terms of commingling funds. But anyway, some kinds of other approaches that might help to augment the funding in a way that is compatible, I guess, with the statutory authorities and so forth. Finally, I'm very curious about the climate change stuff that you've got mentioned in your slides, and I think that this is another real important aspect of the program moving forward. So much of what is facing us as a world involves, of course, addressing the impact and the intersection of climate change with public health and environmental health and health of the environment. So I'm again very encouraged that you're moving in this direction, and excited to see how people will respond to the calls in that area, and seeing whether or not the Superfund program investigators also get on board with that program. In short, I'm very supportive of this program, and feel like it's just been fabulous, and expect it to continue being a wonderful program. So.
Thank you for your kind and insightful comments, and just those couple of thinking outside the box comments. And I think you guys probably know that we collaborative division, so we're always on cross working groups. So we'll be talking. So we appreciate all of those good comments. Is there any other questions? I don't see any questions. David, should I turn this back over to you?
Yep. I was giving the statutory 8-second pause to allow the introverts space to make a comment. So yes, if there are no more discussion on the SRP, may I have a motion for approval?
So moved.
Moved.
Thank
Second.
you. And I think we can take that as a second as well. And if you could please vote.
Quorum has been met.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, everybody, for a great discussion, but not only on the Superfund program, but throughout the day. This has been a packed agenda, and everybody has been on time and on point, and very much engaged. I've thoroughly enjoyed the day. I want to send a few thanks to, as we close out the day, because we couldn't do the day without specifically Liz monitoring the electronic council book. Thank you again for the great work that you do, and Rose for your help in supporting Liz in that. And of course, Nathan and John for running the webinar behind the scenes. We have a very packed agenda tomorrow with the discussion around PFAS. And I want to underscore something that Trevor said. We're focusing on PFAS on this council round because of the National Academy's report. It is one of many exposures that we have. And so we don't want this to turn into an all PFAS all day, every application scenario for us as we go forward. But I think it's a nice way of highlighting our portfolio, how it was relevant to the report and relevant to work going forward, how we can leverage that. We'll look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Thank you.